Richard Jackson from Sheffield, Project Supervisor at ArcHeritage, is going to talk to us about the excavation of the Round Foundry. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. As Bill said, I'm Richard Jackson. I work for an archaeological unit called ArcHeritage, which is part of York Archaeological Trust. In 2019, which does seem like an awfully long time ago now, I was the supervisor of the excavations at the Round Foundry in Holbeck, which will be what I'm talking to you about today. This is an archaeological summary. The history of the site is extensive and not something I will pretend to be an expert in. As will hopefully become clear, there's a lot more to this site than just the 2019 phase of excavations. The question I always start by trying to answer is, why did we excavate this site in particular? In this case, it's because it's considered to be the best preserved example of the earliest surviving integrated engineering works in the world. To give you a very brief overview of the historical phasing, which will have implications later, the land was purchased by Murray and Wood in February of 1796 and grew into a renowned engineering works for the manufacturing of, amongst other things, steam engines, boilers, and various high-end, high-specification design items. It was credited as being the first all under one roof engineering works, where components were designed, cast, built, assembled and finished and tested all at one place, and had a developing reputation for quality as a result. It was undoubtedly as well an integral part of the burgeoning industrial development on the south bank of the River Aire. Murray and Wood's partnership ultimately drew to a close around 1854, having had marked success in the production and sale of self-propelled steam engines and various other types of material like that over a European base. They were exporting engines to Sweden, for example, by 1803. Murray died in 1826, and the whole works was bought by Smith, Beacock and Tannant of the Victoria Foundry in 1855, and that's the main significant chronological threshold we'll be revisiting again. They were responsible for redeveloping much of the site from then on. So you can't have a talk like this without having the obligatory site location plan, just to orientate us all. That's the site there, outlined in red. This is the centre of Leeds. You've got the station there, and the course of the River Aire running through there, I believe, or through there perhaps more correctly. That's the canalised bits up ahead. This is the site boundaries and layout of the plans of site as we dealt with it in 2019. Again, just to orientate you, I'm sure many of you were there on that visit in 2019 when you came out to site to see us working. And I have no doubt that many of you also have a good working knowledge of the site, but that's David Street along the side, which is the current road access, or it was until we started digging up the road, I suppose, that fed off it. Up there is the dry sand foundry. Over there is the green sand foundry. The offices are just between the two. There's a very nice pub in one of those buildings now. This dotted area was the 2006 strip map and record area. That was when Arcus excavated the boring mill, I believe, which was a very complicated series of quite deep excavations. And over here to the south, this solid black line here was our limit of excavation area for the 2019 strip map and record area. And yes, as I say, you've got David Street to the east here, and you've got the alleyway along to the south here. And of course, to the west is where you actually have the former location of the Rotunda building. That's the iconic building that was used as the fitting up shop for assembly of the components and products of the foundry. And that's the iconic building that gives this entire site its name. So what you're looking at here is a plot of the photogrammetry that we undertook at various stages throughout the excavation of the site. This is what the site looked like when we removed the modern car parking surface, and found already that, as was the case with much of the rest of the site when that was excavated, that it was exceptionally well preserved. You can see, for example, the set roadway here, which was the main vehicular access to the east side of site. You've got a pathway coming off that, which does actually connect up to a threshold there as well. The main feature to point out that will be particularly relevant as we go through is this wall here, this substantial brick wall here that does a return there and continues off here. That is the main structural east wall of both the round foundry building in its original version, and later became the east wall of the Victoria foundry when it was bought out and rebuilt. You have your large internal brick surface here, which was very extensive, and I'm only talking about it because we spent a lot of time cleaning it. And my colleague Laura Strafford also spent a lot of time digitizing the bricks for the plans. It's largely just a brick surface, of course. They've made a decision here to lay the bricks in a different orientation. I think that's because it's by the entranceway, and that's probably what saw a great deal of the heavy foot traffic and cartloads of material going in and out through that doorway. So either that's a repair of bricks that wore away quickly, or was a deliberate choice to lay the bricks in a direction which would be more resistant to abrasion, hopefully, or failure anyway. What you can see out the back to the south, these are all later buildings that were developed as the works passed into the 20th century and became more compartmentalized and became home to various different enterprises. But still, as these works do, of course, still using a lot of the 19th century transport infrastructure. Over here, we think actually is probably where they inserted some toilets eventually. These concrete structures here are the drains capping, the capping for the drains there. Lots of made ground out the back. We investigated these structures as well, and they were cut into those. So we were able to establish that this wall in particular is a later dividing wall. And this is just a closer up view of that previous photogrammetry. Hopefully that's clear enough. Perhaps you can make out there is a sandstone block here. It's not entirely clear, but that's the threshold into the works there. And again, it's very rare to get this amount of preservation so close under a car park surface. We were very lucky in that respect, because of course you can see certainly to the west side over here, things become a bit more ragged and a bit less well preserved. But again, indications that when you're doing these sorts of sites, that you may expect further complexities below the ground, because we have various different types of grounds, of floor surface here. There's the sandstone flags out the back here, for example, which I believe may have been part of a little self-contained building attached to the south edge. Over here as well, there was an area of slaggy residues that seem to have just accreted on top of the stone surface, which we may think may be related to cupola furnaces or something like that. This is what lay beneath that brick surface. This is one of the earlier photogrammetry passes we did after the brick surface had been removed. So that principal wall I showed you in the previous slide is sort of over here. One of the first things we exposed, because of course we began stripping from the west limit of excavation and carrying eastwards so that we wouldn't cut ourselves off. So we kind of had to abandon the stratigraphical physical markers we saw already and hope for the best. Already you can see hopefully a large brick wall here. That is actually parallel to the other wall, which will again have implications for the phasing of the site. A lot of this therefore does belong to the Victoria Foundry phase. Whenever you get extensive rebuilding, it's often the death knell for the earlier preservation of earlier phases. But in this case, it seems it was done in such a piecemeal and a continuous way that we ended up with quite a complex interconnecting series of structures, which would represent the ever-developing and evolving engineering workshop. Although when you talk about phases, you're ultimately creating dividing lines between one series of events and another. Archaeologically, it's not that clear. And of course, it's not like they completely knocked down the entire works and started again. And why would you? But they certainly did seem to, if not respect the traditions as such, but carry on using a lot of the material or a lot of the philosophies that were embedded in those structures. And you can also hopefully start to see that these structures here, got one going across there diagonally, another one going that way. Those are drains. Not part of the primary business of metalworking as such, but nonetheless vital to the continued economic success of these sorts of ventures. Because as I'm sure you all know, when you're doing metalworking, you don't want water anywhere near it because the results can be quite catastrophic. The whole area of Holbeck, of course, was originally quite low-lying and marshy, and riddled with lots of becks and streams and various drainage channels, which would have been problematic in the first few years, I think, and reflects why that they've had to take a lot of time and trouble to divert water through the building and out the back, and we shall come back to those later as well. Also, as well, you can see these fire brick surfaces here, which I believe represent some of the external yard surfaces from the round foundry phase. There's also a much more complex interconnecting sequence of structures in this quarter, which we'll look at in a bit more detail first. But this is how the site first looked to us. We try and record as we go, obviously, because that's just good practice. And it certainly makes my job a bit easier in some ways, and can again demonstrate to the clients that we work for that we're already exposing a great deal of complex archaeology, which means that we're earning our money by being there, essentially. Now, this is what we would call the big picture. This was taken on processed on the 21st of August 2019. We finished the second phase strip now. All the brickwork is gone. We've essentially cracked the top of the egg here, and you can see that it is a somewhat substantial structure. Just to give you some idea of scale, and I'm afraid it's not entirely clear, the problem of having such a large, well-preserved building is presenting it adequately to people who obviously want to see it. You want to show as much of it as you can, but you also want to show detail. So that's a bit of a compromise, I'm afraid, here for the general layout. Again, the orientation is the same as those plans we were looking at. So north is at the top of this diagram. I don't know if you can make out just there where my laser pointer is hovering now. That's a red and white scale rod. That's a 2-meter scale rod. Just to give you some idea of what we're looking at here. We've taken away a lot of the stone surfaces directly adjacent to the works, because more than anything, we wanted to make sure there were no earlier phases or earlier structures around. We did that because there was one very small isolated piece of fire brick structure out to the east side here, which doesn't form much of the talk because it didn't make any sense. It was a very small truncated remnant, but perhaps hints that there were various ad hoc structures that were built around the periphery of this building that never really made it onto any mapping records or historical records. But yes, there you have, to talk you through the main structure again, you have the main east wall here, returning there to form the south wall, and then you have this very substantial and later phase red brick wall here. That's the simple part in terms of the main structural sequence. Everything else gets more complicated. You have a range of buildings directly attached here to the south, which we'll come back to later. You also have an extensive set floor, which fits in nicely around those buildings. That yellow line there is where the high voltage electrical cable ran through that was nothing to do with the works at all, but as a later insertion, and was in our way for a significant length of time. And over here, we think we have some ancillary boiler bases, perhaps, which, again, there's not much to say or to present to you of those, because you're looking at the truncated foundation of where a boiler may have sat. But we think that's a reasonable interpretation to be going on with for that structure. Photogrammetry, I should point out, is our preferred recording method for these types of sites, because they are very complicated. Hand planning is preferable in some circumstances, but with this, once we got the site as clean as we possibly can, we simply take hundreds and hundreds of digital photographs from various different angles on a day with perfect weather, ideally, where it's not too sunny, because hard shadow lines ruin this sort of thing. Then I feed all those into some software that we use, and that creates a 3D model of the entire site. That's then what we use to create these two-dimensional views, which we then export into CAD to trace for our scale plans. It's in many ways a more efficient and preferable system, and frankly, for doing presentations like this, it is really, really nice to be able to present you with a bird's eye view of the site. It's useful for us on site as well when we're working there, because we're able to print out these while the site is still going, so we then annotate the copies of these drawings ourselves. So it's another round of quality assurance for us. On to the next slide. This is where we'll mention the phasing. These are our results of the excavation overlaid on the Giles 1815 plan. In terms of our understanding of the site, it's worth pointing out that I have so far only written the assessment report. This is a preliminary phase of reporting, which is, to be brutally honest, no fun to read. And it's not much fun to write either, and is going to require much more attention to bring more clarity to the multiple successive phases of the site. That's going to be refined for the final report. But again, you can see here the main east wall there and the south wall there are good fits for the 1815 plan. I also mentioned as well those fire brick surfaces that I pointed out to you earlier. They're highlighted in yellow here. So again, considering that they stop short there for no apparent reason other than they would have been bounded by that wall, that is a good interpretation that they were probably the external yard surface within this horseshoe of buildings. Again, a rare surviving early phase part of that site, which didn't have much sealed beneath it, and doesn't intrinsically tell us much itself, but is nonetheless a useful marker showing the state of preservation that we have. Just in here, as well as the location of some of the sandstone surfaces, which we'll be talking about shortly. And again, you can see the extra workshop built out the back and the possible boiler houses and boiler bases there. Unfortunately, the main sort of connecting parts between this range to the west and that range to the east are no longer with us due to the high voltage electrical cable, but you can't win them all, and generally speaking, the preservation was actually rather good. This is the same information overlaid on the 1895 plan of the site. This is it is late on in the phase of the Victoria Foundry, but it does serve a few useful purposes. That's one of our walls there that we established was a later wall, but that's a subdivision wall within the works, or within the forge and boiler buildings to the south, at any rate. And again, it looks like these were areas that then were originally open. So this floor surface area here may have been open originally and then enclosed at some point later on. Interestingly enough, of course, these buildings over here on the left-hand side of our excavation area on the west side don't really fit into any of the maps, which is entirely typical, and is of course why we do archaeology on sites like this, frankly. The maps are incredibly useful to certainly understand the broad strokes of the building, but it always seems to be the addition of archaeology to highlight these little structural areas that may not have received attention from a mapping phase, but were nonetheless certainly present and part of the works. And as I was talking about the phase reconstruction of the works, this is a fairly good example of that. This is an excavated section we made through the main east wall, which, if you remember, that was on that's a match for the earliest phase that we have on the plans. Archaeologically, it looks like it's been rebuilt. You can see here we've got a foundation slab, or a series of sandstone foundation slabs running north to south. This is the south-facing section of the intervention we took through that wall. Interestingly enough, the upper structure does not align properly with that foundation. There may have been structural reasons for that I'm unaware of, but it could also be a case for saying that they rebuilt it and for some reason decided to shift the axis of the wall slightly to the west. Our evidence as well for it being a slightly later rebuild as well is that you see these deposits to the right hand side to the east there. They're quite well laminated and coherent, but there is a construction cut through them. That suggests possibly, at least, that considering that we know that these were the first buildings built on this area, it does seem likely, therefore, that this was a cut truncating not only the ground surface, but a concomitant wall as well, which they then rebuilt and relaid. It's not a definitive answer at all, but it just does point to the further complexities of dealing with a well-preserved set of structures like this. And again, phased reconstruction. This is a view of the southwest corner of the foundry building, or the forge building rather. This is where the south wall, as you can see coming along here, then returns to the north. This was something we actually noticed quite late on. It may have even been when I was taking these photographs that we noticed it. You can see, hopefully, that the alignment is odd. It's not a completely true straight east-west wall. There's a definite kink here, which is why the scale rod is placed there to highlight that. And again, here to the south, to the west as well, you've got a later black ash mortared wall. I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain precisely why that was done or to precisely fit that into any specific phase of construction here, but it does demonstrate that this was very much a continuation building. It wasn't fixed as a solid building at one point and then ultimately respected. It was adapted and rebuilt and reconstructed almost continuously, I think. If there wasn't major works going on to the outside of the building, I suspect there were always major works going on inside the building, which is, it says here in my notes, that gives us a wealth of structural evidence to interpret. And I suspect that's going to be going on for quite some time, because we all love a good argument. Not everyone would agree with that, of course. For future reference as well, the structures you can see over here to the left are all inside the forge building, the main forge building anyway. The structures over here to the right are those part of that small workshop tacked on to the south. I'd now like to show you a few of the internal structures of the main forge building, starting with the drains. Get those out of the way. They are what may be considered to be secondary structures compared to hearths or anvil bases, but they were extensive throughout the building and are worth a mention. multiple phases again, and that were, as I said, just as vital as the operation of the works as casting pits or anything like that. There's a principal main drain running down the middle of the building. I have, just to obviously to say, I have reorientated this to get a bit of a closer view of this end of the works. North is now to the right of the building, and the top of the image is the west. But yes, if you follow the laser pointer, you can see the line of a drain going through here all the way to the back corner. You have another intersecting drain coming along here and feeding into that main drain. You've got what appear to be the remains of a shallower earlier drain, I think, that has been much more badly truncated due to successive use of that area. Over here, rather interestingly, you've got this strange little S-shaped curve of a drain that did appear to have been deliberately blocked off at this end at a later stage. And indeed, if we take the point of view that that relates to the rebuilding or rather the construction of this Victoria Foundry phase here, that may reflect a redesign of the layout of the drainage and may be contemporary to this large salt glazed sewer pipe or drain pipe that we've got running along the outside of the building there. The earlier phase drains this is an interesting diversion here over on the right hand side, which we'll come back to in more detail in a subsequent slide. But mainly the drains do all seem to run to this point here, where the red box is highlighting. That's the main south wall of the foundry, the forge building there. So it does seem that all of these drains were intended to pass the drainage water through the building and out the other side, ultimately feeding into Benyon Beck, which is now culverted but runs along the line of that alleyway to the south of the site. So yes, that small area highlighted in red is where we found this piece of material. This, we believe, is a sluice gate, which when we finally excavated it and removed some of the brickwork encasing it, was rusted shut in the downward or closed position. It was fitted within vertical slots in the surrounding brickwork, and we think its purpose was to prevent water backing up from Benyon Beck during times of heavy flooding, which obviously would have been catastrophic for metalworking activities within the forge. And not only do we think it played a key structural role, it could well be a product of the works here. There's no reason to suspect that people who ran this sort of engineering works would outsource any of their internal structures. So it seems a fair assumption that they made this piece of equipment here. And as such, it is the only substantial piece of finished metalwork recovered during the 2019 excavations. It is something that people are always keen for us to look for, and obviously we're keen to find. But time and time again, of course, you do learn and accept that metal, whether it's cast or wrought, definitely has a substantial value to this works, and as such is always treated as a raw material. If it could be remelted and turned into something else that could be then subsequently sold, it would be. So you don't get lots of chance material just lying around, because certainly as well, if you've had a change of ownership as well, that forms part of the lock, stock and barrel sale to the next people. But this, however, stayed in place, and I suspect that part of the reason it stayed in place was because it was ridiculously heavy. We did remove it from site. I think it took 3 of us to get it into a vehicle, and it is currently safe in the stores in Sheffield awaiting further metallurgical assessment, which will be part of the final assessment. And now we're going to take a look at some of the structures in the southeast corner of the forge, as you can see highlighted in that red box there. Not as clear cut as some of the main principal phasing, but it does demonstrate what we were presented with as archaeologists and attempting to understand. You've got a few interrelating features here. Just over there, you've got a sandstone surface, a sandstone flagstone surface rather, a continuation of that here. It seems to be bisected by this earlier drain. The preservation's not that good right up to the edge of it, so whether it's whether they're all contemporary or if one preceded the other, it's not something we can necessarily answer. The other interesting aspect is that at this orientation, you have what is, to all intents and purposes, a cut feature. You can just see the edges of the cut here going into the clay underlying everything, which we found was subsequently backfilled with various bits of rubble, and a similar crossing feature here as well. So unusually, it does appear in some parts of this forge building that they were actually completely removing what we assume to be earlier subdivision phases or phases that related to that original range of the round foundry building. It is highly unusual for that to be done because, of course, 99 times out of 100, pragmatism is the driving factor with these things. And if you don't need to demolish a wall below where it is functionally a problem, you know, if it's not in the way, you leave the foundations in the ground. For whatever reason, they may have taken these out, possibly to prevent groundwater accruing in various areas, or maybe because they simply wanted to reuse the materials elsewhere. I am, of course, speculating now on what isn't there, so that's not entirely profitable. You can just see as well over on that edge, that's the capping for another system of another drainage system that ran along the main south wall at the back there. So again, this was that area I pointed out at first on the historic overlays, and may well relate to some quite early round foundry flooring surfaces. Surrounding this floor surface was a series of square structures that were repeated and redistributed all around the inside faces of the building. This is a closer view of one of them. They were attached to the internal elevations of the main walls. This particular structure you're looking at now was located up against the main east wall. That's the east wall there. It was fitted with an iron plate that you can just about see the remains of there, and it's heavily worn through. We believe these structures are related to the hearths for the heating of small metal components prior to working. So these are not the actual working surface itself, but the foundations of it, as is typical with most structural evidence from an industrial archaeological site. We're looking at a surviving fragment of a foundation, and it's perhaps unreasonable to expect a full explanation of what was directly above it based on the inspection of those foundations in isolation. But a fuller interpretation will always look at the spatial relationships within that building. In this case, the location of each of those structures close to the main walls would allow for the possibility for the smoke and heat generated by hot works to be funneled or extracted through metal hoods attached to the side walls and up into chimneys. The constant thermal stress caused by that to the main structures may also help to explain why the main east wall was so extensively rebuilt. And again, to highlight the complexity of these, the sequencing here, you can just about see in the ground there's a cut into the natural clay that's been backfilled with demolition rubble. So again, earlier phases tantalizingly possibly present beneath the later phase structures. Not all the so-called hearth structures were identical as well. This photograph shows one of the structures located up against the south wall of the forge, incidentally built directly on top of one of the drainage channels. The form is quite similar, the dimensions are fairly similar, but the sloping base of the structure is constructed from sandstone slabs. So this may perhaps be just a lesser preservation of something that would have had that metal plate fitted into it. And now we come to the large structure to the right of the picture, which is located towards the north end of the forge building. As you may remember from the overlays, it doesn't really fit within the bounds of the round foundry building. It's just to the west of where we believe that main wall would have been, which is probably running along here somewhere. It's very awkward when you write up these sorts of sites because you want to ascribe everything to a definitive phase, but sometimes that's simply not possible based on the available evidence. One of the later phases of the round foundry plan does show two independent small structures within that central courtyard area. Unfortunately, it's not a great fit physically for that either. It may therefore belong to the Victoria Foundry. That's the simplest explanation, or it's possibly a later addition to the round foundry that wasn't adequately mapped. That does happen, of course. And here's a close-up. This is a closer view of that substantial structure looking to the east. We're interpreting it as some sort of anvil base or hammer base for a substantial, possibly steam-powered hammer. And as such, it would fit with the later development of the machinery that was being manufactured here and sold here. One could go quite a long way with interpreting such a later insertion. It does kind of stand as an important threshold if these sorts of complex machines are being built in this workshop and then being used to build later versions of itself. There's something interesting there, and of course it would have acted as a great sales piece too, because if you were having people coming and viewing your foundry or your works to see what you were making while they were coming to order things, they would be undoubtedly impressed by the operation of such machinery. And of course, when Bolt and Watt were sneaking around as well, perhaps they may have taken a view to these things too. You can see at the back, we're back to the drains again, of course. You can see at the back of the image there, the side view of what looks like a slightly irregular alignment of drains. And this is a view off the side of the hammer base there. You can see the massive sandstone slabs there, or blocks rather. You can see the original line of the drain. That's up at the back there is where this drain would have come through straight. So it's obviously been rebuilt to continue to function around the hammer base. So as despite the fact that these were much earlier structures, by the time this hammer base was put in, they were still necessary. That's a lot of work to go to divert such a thing. But obviously it was necessary to do so, and does have implications to the phasing of lots of connected structures. We know that obviously if they're connected to the diverted drain here, then they were later phased. And now we come to the small workshop to the rear of the forge. An interesting layout that, again, the angles of these walls probably were done to fit up against pre-existing structures or pre-existing access ways. There's no real reason to build these oblique angles unless you're fitting into a compartmentalized site that is already short on space. So despite the fact we don't have much structural evidence for anything to the south of this structure, it still very much implies from that alignment of walls that it's fitting into somewhere where space was already at a premium. The archaeological sites, complicated as they are, never truly reflect the mess and the hustle and bustle of a live engineering works, where space is at a premium, but also tidiness and organization is vital for safe and efficient and, of course, profitable operation of these things. So yeah, the area outlined in red is here. This is viewed looking north. A series of small bunkers, we think, that had plenty of coal residue and a bit of slag waste in them as well. Not a lot really to hang an interpretation on, but the stone slab you can see here had quite an accretion of metal waste on them as well. So is it an additional workspace that might duplicate some of the processes undertaken in the main building? which is, of course, further evidence of expansion and indirect evidence of rebuilding in the main forge to the north. The insertion of that anvil base we were looking at in previous slides, for example, may have represented a shift in the engineering focus of the activities in the main forge building. So they no longer had enough space to undertake all the tasks that had previously been carried out there, and that necessitated this extension out the back. But again, it's very well organized space. Those are a nice small, approximately 50 centimeter wide spaces, which would have helped with the functioning of such a forge. If people were wanting to work metal on a consistent basis, you need some sort of storage bins nearby, or they were simply, again, ash catchers for the waste. But nonetheless, they represent quite a rigorous organization of a process that was going on in the main building in a much more spread out type of a way. And now we'll finish on a nice working shot of the site. It is again worth pointing out that this was undertaken at the very final stage of archaeological mitigation of this site. You can see the buildings to the north there. That's the drafting offices, I think, up there, and I believe that's the end of the green sand foundry building, I think. And over here, where all the vehicles are parked and the fencing is, that's where the boring mill would have been. So what we were dealing with here was very much the less well understood, but nonetheless complex and very well preserved southern end of an incredibly complex and well known and justifiably world famous engineering works.